Hi, I'm Fred Minnick, and the panel you're about to watch was from 2016. This was at my Legend series at the Kentucky Derby Museum. I wrote the book Whiskey Women, The Untold Story of How Women Save Bourbon, Scotch, and Irish Whiskey. These four women on the panel, Andrea Wilson, Pamela Heilmann, Marianne Barnes, Victoria MacRae-Samuels, they all played a part in that book and in basically the growth of women in the distilling industry. Now, today, women are everywhere, but when I wrote that book, when I was researching that book, there were not as many women in key distilling roles. And these four women are some of the pioneers of the contemporary sense of growing the female presence in the distilling community. I think they are four incredible women. I hope you enjoy the interview that I had with them as much as I did. And plus, we tasted some good bourbon. So enjoy the 2016 Legend series with four amazing women.
I would not allow a woman to be a distiller. And so, despite all this, women have always been a part of the Kentucky distillery community, either through like the bottling lines or through the distilling or in marketing. Women have always made a large portion of the employees. And as we've learned in recent years, women are a big reason behind the current growth. So it's with my absolute honor to present tonight's panel. This is the first time we've had an entire panel for our Legend series. And tonight I have with me Maker's Mark's Victoria Samuels. Marianne Barnes with the former Old Taylor Distillery. They don't have a new name yet, unless you want to announce it here tonight.
I can't. I wish I could.
Allegedly. And we have... This is something you'll find amazing. Michter's, when they started their distillery here, basically got two of the highest senior women in the industry working for them, and so I asked them both to be on the panel. So we have Pamela Heilmann, Andrea Wilson with Michter's. So I want to just kind of start talking about how each of you got into whiskey. Now, Andrea, I want to go ahead and start with you because I know you started when you were 4 years old making moonshine in your grandpa's basement, if I'm right.
I didn't know you were really going to say that.
I'm kidding. That was, statute of limitations has passed, but I was kidding. I do not have proof she was making moonshine when she was 4 years old. How did you start in whiskey?
Well, the start into whiskey was really inspired by my grandfather, because my grandfather was a known moonshiner. He actually aspired to work for Maker's Mark, but could not because he was a known moonshiner, and met my grandmother, and then my grandmother wouldn't marry him until he stopped moonshining because that was an illegal activity. It still is today. He finally quit. He went to work for American Standard and had a great long career with them. But over the years, he would take us fishing, and one of the places he loved to go was Maker's Mark Pond. And his friends all still worked at Maker's Mark, so we'd always get a little stop in the distillery at the end of our plentiful fishing trip. And then it was always curious to me why he loved it so much, why he was so passionate about it, why he did what he did, and it was just fascinating to me. So I kind of grew up. We'd have these conversations because we could never talk about it in the house. It was forbidden. I mean, it was a shameful thing, and so we couldn't discuss it. So if you wanted to talk about the old days or find out these crazy stories that my grandfather had, you had to do that outside of the house. And so, it's just intrigue. It was just the whole interest and intrigue. And we always used to get to sample the mash when we were at Maker's Mark, so that was always fun for me. And so I just kind of grew up like, how do I do this? I want to do this. How do I get involved? And so when I went to, think about college and things like that, it was really, there's no school. It's not like, you decide, oh, I want to go to medical school, I'm going to be a doctor. There's the school. It wasn't like that. So I really had to talk to people in the industry, try to find out, how do you get involved? How do you do something like this? So I decided to go into chemical engineering, pursued a career in that. And then when I graduated, what I learned was everybody who's in the industry stays in the industry, and then you can't find a job. So I was like, oh, well, what am I going to do? So I thought, well, I probably need to go actually get some experience before I try to pursue this anyway. So I went into consulting. I consulted for about 10 years. And that was a great thing for me because I got to work in manufacturing and all different types of manufacturing, learn how things were made, learn how processes work, learn about people, unions, all these different facets that go into production. And then finally I worked, I got a consulting ask from Diageo. And so I worked for 2 years as a consultant for them. And then they hired me full time, and that was the start of my career in the distilling business. And I was very, very excited about that. I felt like I'd worked really, really hard to achieve something that was like the dream for me, and I'm still living it today. So now I work for Michter's, and I'm very proud of that. I'm proud of continuing to be in this industry, and so we forge ahead.
It's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Pamela, how did you get into whiskey?
My story's a little different. I didn't grow up in Kentucky. I grew up in New York, central New York. And about 25 years ago, my husband and I got transferred down here. I always worked historically in kind of male-dominated industries. I came from a steel mill in New York and got transferred down here and to a plant in Elizabethtown. And my husband was the plant manager. I was a supervisor at the time, and they had told us they were going to sell the plant. So my husband said, I think one of us needs to find another job. And guess what? It wasn't him. But it was the best thing I ever did. I happened to mention to a friend of mine that, hey, I'm looking for a new job. And she said, well, Jim Beam loves great supervisors. They're always looking for good supervisors. I know the human resource manager over there, and I'll talk to him. Well, he called me the next day and gave me like a 2-hour interview on the phone, and 2 weeks later, I was given my notice and working for Jim Beam.
And what was your job there when you started at Jim Beam?
When I started at Jim Beam, I was a relief supervisor.
Okay.
Actually, Victoria knows that job well, too. I started as a relief supervisor, and what that was in the distillery, we were working 6 days a week. So they gave everybody 2 days off, but not always a Saturday and a Sunday. Some would get a Monday and a Sunday, some would get a Tuesday and a Sunday, and whatever else. And I was the person that relieved on the days they didn't work. So I worked all 3 shifts. I worked all 3 shifts in the same week. So Monday and Tuesday would be like a 12 to 8. Wednesday, Thursday was a 4 to 12. Friday was my day off, and Saturday I'd be on day shift. So that's how I started. And then from there, I loved it. For somebody who had never worked a shift in her life, starting at, I won't tell you what age, working all 3 shifts all days of the week, it was challenging. But I loved it. I loved what I learned. I loved every day that I went there, the people I worked with. It was like a family. I was at Bourbon. I started out at both plants. I worked at Claremont and Bourbon, and then ultimately...
And Bourbon's in Boston, Kentucky, for those that don't know.
Yeah, Boston, Kentucky. Largest bourbon distillery in the world, I think, still, they say. But I worked there full-time from that point on. I got promoted from one job to another, senior supervisor, and ultimately ended up, for the last 8 years of my career there, as distillery manager of the largest bourbon distillery in the world. We had a major expansion while I was there, which made us that. It was a great experience. I loved it. I got to meet Booker, got to work with him on some projects. I was hooked from day one that I started there. Just loved the people. It was a family. And here, a couple of years ago, I got offered another great opportunity with another family, which has turned out to be awesome. I've met lots of great people, had new experiences, have actually been in a very different business environment, from the large giant to the family-run business, and I've learned a whole lot of new things and had a whole lot of new experiences that I've never had.
And you're cranking out whiskey now. You got give us an
we
update.
Are cranking out whiskey now.
Give us an
Very
update
well.
on the new distillery.
We started with our new still in August. Barreled our first barrel the end of August. I think it was August 27th, if I'm not mistaken, is the date. Last year, and we've been going ever since. We're working every day we can. Right now, we've just got one shift, but eventually it'll be 24 hours someday, we hope, as demand comes. So,
That's awesome.
Yeah, we're excited, and I'm having a ball. It was just an awesome opportunity that I was afforded by the Marianne family, and I've loved every day of it since. And got to actually work with another wonderful woman, which is unusual in the industry, to actually have another woman in the same office that you get to work with and share experiences and learn from. So it's been great.
Well, women are everywhere on all sides of things now in the production circles, and you started, Marianne, at Brown-Forman. Let's just go right to the beginning. Like, how did you get into whiskey?
I never dreamt I would get into whiskey. I grew up in a dry county in Oldham County, and I don't know who's from Kentucky, just so I know who I'm talking to. Okay, we've got a few, about half the group. That's good. So Oldham County is a suburb of Louisville, and Louisville is where Michter's is and a lot of large distilleries, but there's many in Kentucky, and not nearly as many now as there used to be. But I thought I might be doing auto mechanics or something like that. When I was in high school, I was in auto shop. I had an interest in tinkering and engines and fixing things. And once I went to go tour a couple schools for diesel mechanics, I was like, maybe this is not the group of folks for me. Maybe that's not exactly what I want to do. So I took a little bit of time off after high school and started a business with my mom, and completely opposite of what I was interested in, the math and the science that I was doing in high school. It was a consignment art and crafts store in downtown LaGrange. We sold authentic Italian gelato, and unfortunately it didn't last very long. It was about a year and a half, and I had to get serious about going back to college again. So had a sit down with my father, and he suggested chemical engineering. And I hadn't really thought about that as a career path. And then after looking at the opportunities in chemical engineering, I was like, well, this is pretty cool. There's applications in everything. If I want to make cosmetics, if I want to make fuel additives, I can do that with a chemical engineering degree. So I started in school in 2007. There was a couple prerequisite courses that I needed before I got into the actual Speed School of Engineering program. And then 2 years after that, I was looking for an internship and interviewed with everybody I could because I knew that I needed to get those skills, but also just really didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. So it came down to a choice between renewable energy and making bourbon. And of course, the internship at Brown-Forman that I interviewed for was the one that everybody wanted because, gosh, we were in college and you're 20-ish, 21 years old. I mean, that's what you want to do. So I accepted the internship with Brown-Forman, and that's when I really fell in love with the industry. In a distillery, you use every major unit operation that you learn in engineering school. So I was doing heat exchange and distillation and fermentation and filtration and all these shins that you learn while you're going through school, and it was fascinating, and I developed a passion for it. I was volunteering to work every hour I possibly could. I spent a lot of time in our pilot plant. I've started in a role in research and development, which meant that I had the opportunity to go see all of the distilleries that Brown-Forman owned, and that wasn't just bourbon. It was, tequila and vodka, and there were some. I didn't own a rum while I was there, or a gin, unfortunately. So I never got to go down to the Caribbean or over to England, but. Yeah, it was an amazing opportunity, and that's when I really figured out that maybe this industry is really for me. And fortunately, my palate developed really quickly, and like these ladies, I just fell in love with the production aspect of it.
You were always very impressive very early on. I remember meeting you thinking, I don't know about her. I don't know what she... I had no idea what you did. Like, I really didn't. You were just kind of there tasting and everything. You were very impressive. And when we first met, you hadn't even been named Master Taster, or you were just
probably still
following,
training with
kind of like
Chris.
following Chris around.
Yeah, I worked in research and development for, it was 3 years before I got hired on as a full-time employee. And then right away, they targeted me for some, like a guinea pig production experience trial. So Pam was working all 3 shifts. I hadn't done shift work, so I was sleeping on an air mattress in the basement when I was working night shift to try and block out the lights so I could actually function at work. I was managing a crew of up to 30 people. It was a bottling operation, so high-speed bottling line, 400 bottles a minute, and I was responsible for every single one of those coming off the line. They chose me for that, and then after that 6 months of trial by fire experience, I think they saw something in me and offered me the opportunity to start training with Chris Morris, the master distiller.
So, Victoria, you've been in the distilling business for 27 years now. How did you start?
Well, it's so interesting because I listen to ladies' stories and how they get into the industry. And oftentimes, if they're in production, it's because they have a science background. And I'm no different. It's not like I'm going to say, oh, but I'm different. I grew up in Seattle, Washington. And there was no bourbon in Seattle when I was going to the University of Puget Sound as an undergraduate. And then I went to University of Washington as a graduate student in theoretical physical chemistry. Okay? So it's sort of like, it kind of connects the dots and how our minds all work. And I was living in San Francisco at the time, working for a company doing statistics analyzing of a business modeling for that company for forecasting and budgeting. And I was thinking, ooh, the wine industry, because, do we ever really realize what we want to do when we grow up? Don't we always kind of get drawn to something that's interesting, and that we kind of have an interest in or a passion for? And, of course, in San Francisco, near Sonoma, Napa was very small then. For those of you who've been out there recently, it's no longer quite so small. And I decided to take a holiday. And I had never been to the West Coast, the East Coast, the southeast part of our state. And I was traveling with some friends, started up in Maine, kind of was driving, working our way down, wanted to go to the Carolinas, and I had never been to Kentucky. And I thought, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. So we diverted, and you know how in the 80s you could travel, and if you knew somebody, they might know somebody, and they would introduce you, and you would, get to sit down with the family. I found myself at dinner at Booker's house, okay?
Booker No.
The
legendary Booker No.
The grandson of Jim Beam. And we were talking, and he was kind of fascinated. You're a girl, and you're a chemist. Huh. And for those of us who know Booker, you can just hear his voice saying that, right? And what he said to me was very interesting. Because I didn't know anything about bourbon, and so he was having me taste bourbon, and we were talking and just engaging with the people that were there at dinner. It was a fairly small group, and he said, I have a chemist at the distillery. And I have a quality chemist, but this other chemist, I want to know more about how bourbon ages. I really want to understand what happens in the barrel, what happens with the heat, what happens in the warehouse. And so I need another chemist, and I need you to come work for me. I thought, okay, but I know nothing about bourbon. And he said, that's okay. You'll learn about bourbon. You will learn about it as you go. So I said, well, I'll think about it. So, I went back home, and I was at my job, and I thought about it, and darned if I didn't pack up my cat and my little Honda Civic and drive all the way over to Kentucky and start working for Booker Noe as a research chemist in the R&D department. And what I got to do every day was I got to go out and ask the team to give me samples of the different places in the process of making bourbon. Off the still, the new distillate, out of the fermenters, because I'm a chemist, so I'm trying to study this holistic process in the warehouse. And I will remember the first time I went into a bourbon warehouse. So, who's been to a distillery? Yes. Who's gone into a warehouse of a distillery? Yes, if you haven't raised your hand, hopefully you will soon. But when you walk in and you smell that smell, and it's just like, there it is. That is bourbon. And we all have experienced that at one point in our lives. And it's like, I was hooked. But what I was hooked on was getting out of the lab and going to take the samples. And I approached my then manager and I said, I'd like to be considered to get out of the lab. I've done a lot of work. I was now at about year 2 in R&D lab. Actually had developed some tests and some test protocols and research to identify the components of aging whiskey and how whiskey ages in the barrel, as well as components in the new distillate and how it moves through the still during distillation. And I had done some good work, and I said, I want to get out in operations. Well, as Pam knows, the response that I was met with was, we've never had a woman supervisor at Jim Beam, and we just don't really think it'll work. And I said, okay. So I kept at it, and I kept asking, and finally I got tapped. And they said, and I was so tickled, to get called in. I'm now going to get to go work in production. And I had just had a child. She was 1 year old. And they said, we've got a position for you. As Pam explained, Jim Beam, the 2 distilleries, were now going to 6-day production, which required coverage of the shifts that nobody wanted to work, right? And they said, we have this position for you, Victoria, and it's going to be a challenge if you're interested. Now, if you can do this position, you can do anything in the industry. But I'll just tell you, it's really like the worst job in the industry. It's really, you're not really going to want it. They've never had a woman work in the distillery before. There's certain parts of the distillery where you cannot go. But, we'll give you a shot if you want to do it. And I said, sign me up. So this was prior to Pam joining. I worked both distilleries, all shifts. So 2 seconds, 2/3, 2 facilities, back and forth. And I did that for 5 years. In the course of the 5 years, not only did I really get out of my head as far as theoretical fermentation, but doesn't it test you? And you get your hands in there, and you smell it, and you taste it, and you work with the product, and the team teaches you everything. And I really absorbed the passion of the team for the process they were doing. And I also had a second child. Not too simple a task in all of that, but it was worth it, because then I was offered a position in the processing area, where when the barrels are dumped, you get to work with the filtration and the presentation to take it to the bottling line. And then I spent 2 years as a quality control manager. So I then got to even see a different part of the business. And around that time, 2008, Bill Samuels Jr., who met Bill Samuels Jr.? Okay, he's about as outspoken and engaging as Booker was as well. And Bill came to me and he said, you know what, I need a director of operations. Do you want to come to Maker's Mark? And you worked with my great family friend, our family friend, the Noes. Now you come to Maker's Mark and learn about Maker's Mark. And I went to Maker's Mark in 2008, and in 2010 was named Vice President of Operations at Maker's Mark. So what I'm responsible for on a daily basis is everything that happens at the distillery, from the incoming grain to the distillation parameters, to the aging of the barrels, to the building of the warehouses, to the processing of the product to the bottling, and then, of course, the shipping out, and yes, even somewhat the landscaping. So I've been very, very privileged throughout 27 long years to actually find something that is so uniquely Kentucky. It is so defined by the people. It's defined by the teams that I've had the privilege of working for. It's defined by the people I've had the privilege of working with. But most of all, it's been defined by the people who have created those brands and those products. You know, and you look back and you look at the founders. I look at Bill Sr. and Marge and how they created Maker's Mark in the 50s just as a hobby. It was pure and simple a hobby for them, looking for something to share with their friends. And I know my commitment, and again, having spent many years with these ladies and getting to know Marianne, I know one of the things that all of us in the industry want to do, just like the folks at Churchill Downs, is we want to share our product, we want to share our brands with everyone and with the consumers. So it's been a privilege for me to be in the industry for this long.
That's a good segue for me for something I forgot. At the top of it, I was supposed to tell you about, you know, during this, please feel free to do social media. Do your Twitter, your Facebook, your Instagram, Snapchat. Are there any other ones that I'm missing? Anything invented this week?
Can we get our phones out too?
You're welcome. You want to do some hashtagging? Yeah. So the hashtag here is hashtag Legend Series. And you will find us on Twitter, all of us on Twitter, with Michter's, Maker's Mark, and Marianne, of course, and same with Facebook. So just search for us, do the hashtag, and we'll reply when we're off the stage. Victoria, I want to come back to you. You're hired in 2008. I don't remember exactly when, but around that time, you were diagnosed with breast cancer, and you're a breast cancer survivor.
Yes, I am. So one of the questions I always people ask me is, how do you stay fresh? You know, what is your key to having that passion, having that drive, doing what you do for the industry and in the position that I hold? And I always talk about my commitment to the team and you know, how we all work together, but I also talk about never stopping to learn. You know, I think learning and growing is something that everything that you have said, each of you have said, is all about taking life as it comes, learning and growing from it and moving to the next level. Not necessarily that you're dissatisfied and running away from something, but you're moving towards something. And in late 2012, actually, I was looking at what are the things that I need to learn, even at this late age and late stage in my career, to help my team and empower my team. And I actually went back to get my MBA. Okay, so I had just enrolled in the EMBA class at Bellarmine course in February of 2013, and I had just started, and it was fascinating to me to engage with business people and learn different things that I could bring back to Maker's Mark. And then in July of 2013, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And at first, you know, I thought, oh, it just can't be, right? It just can't be. There's zero risk of cancer of any kind in my family, okay? I routinely go for all the exams I'm supposed to go for every single year, and I'm sure you all do that as well, or at least you will after you leave here tonight, correct? And I was diagnosed, and I had to stop and really take stock, you know, looking at what I have done, what I have accomplished, and what do I choose to do? Well, what do we choose to do? Right before, when we first kind of reacquainted ourselves before everyone showed up this evening, you know, Andrea made a comment, Pam made a comment, we were talking about different things that impact us, and we all said the same thing: you just keep going, right? You just keep on going. You just keep doing what you do. You keep taking care of your friends and your family. You keep taking care of yourself, which is key, and you just keep moving forward. I think, you know, Fred, we've spoken before a lot about that, and it's like, how does it impact the people around you, and what do you learn? You know, what do you really learn? You learn to do what you're passionate about doing. You learn to value the time and manage your time so that you can be with who's the most important people in our lives? Our loved ones, our friends, our families, and our loved ones. So while we talk and speak with great passion about what we do for a career. I think the remarkable thing is that, especially for women in this industry, it's very, very important to learn to balance. And people talk about life-work balance. I don't think there is such a thing. I think there's periods of time where you give it 100% in one area, and then you have to come back and give it 100% in another area. I don't think you're ever walking around being balanced. I mean, really, who is that? And the opportunity that opens up for people, both men and women, in the business world, in this generation, in the distilled spirits industry, is it really engages the next generation in becoming interested in Kentucky's industry, in the distillation industry. We speak about it, we're open about it, and it invites that engagement. And I think that's really key. For me personally, it's kind of like just keep on moving, keep on doing what you need to do, and always go get your yearly exams. Okay?
Well, I think anyone who beats cancer deserves a round of applause.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And if there's anyone in this audience tonight, here's for you.
In fact, there are several I know.
Yeah.
So, when I was researching Whiskey Women, there was always a woman who stood out in various points. Marjorie-Samuels with Maker's Mark creates the bottle and the wet red wax and the name Maker's Mark, Bourbon Hall of Famer. And in Scotland, there was this woman named Bessie Williamson. She was the distillery manager, later owner of Lefroy. And she comes to the United States in the 1960s and is basically a Scotch whiskey ambassador. And she starts getting single malts on bar shelves here. And there were a lot of stories written about her. And every one of them was about, a girl's doing whiskey. A woman's doing whiskey. And the entire story wasn't about the single malts. It was about the fact that a woman was presenting whiskey to Americans. And in fact, if you ever saw recordings of her interviews or anything, she was very knowledgeable about whiskey. And so I just want to ask, are we past that point now where people no longer come up to you and say, wow, you're a woman and you're in whiskey? I mean, Marianne, you're fascinating to me because you've just experienced this, and people want interview all the time. Are we past that now? Is it common that people still ask you that 1950s era question?
It is actually it is probably one of the big questions that I get asked. How did you get into it? What drew you to it? And I don't know that it's just about being a female. It's about being a young female. But I had an interesting interaction, and I'll tell you all about this. About 3 weeks ago, I was judging a spirits competition and had the opportunity to sit in with, a lot of really influential people in the industry, and they picked me out to be the anchor judge, and Fred knows what a responsibility that is. So I'm in charge of, taking everybody else's info or their comments and, guiding them through. And one of the other judges was Dave Shurett, is a very well-known master distiller, and he worked for Brown-Forman, but I had not ever met him before. But we locked eyes a couple times, and I knew exactly who he was, and I learned later that he knew exactly who I was too. So it was the second day before we actually spoke to one another, and it was on the bus ride back to the hotel, and sat down, and he said, hi, Marianne, I'm Dave Shurett. I just wanted to introduce myself. And I said, hi, Dave, I know exactly who you are, and I've been dying to meet you. And he said, yes, I wanted to come over right away and introduce myself, but then I stopped myself because he said, I've heard, through the media all about you, but what I really wanted to know is are you fake or not? Learning about whether I was just for show. Because he had never interacted with me in the workplace. He just knew me through the media. And he said, you're the real deal. So that was, not that I needed the validation, but there are skeptics because of this appearance. And it's not going to be an uncommon thing, but hopefully we'll move past that. I've been reading a bunch of articles from women over in Scotland, been in the industry for, decades, and it's commonplace over there. So, the more women that get into science fields, the more women will flood the industry, and we can move past it. And I think we're getting there. Yeah. A lot of women moving toward there.
Now, since you all are basically you're almost equal, you outnumber the Michter's production team. Is it because, you guys you're dominating it? Well, in the tasting rooms, you've got a very nice female presence. Like, I've been there at your facility, and there are women everywhere. There's not a feeling that this is a male-dominated company. Does it feel like, that it's just a workplace? Is it brought out that, oh, you're a woman, so you'll pick up this flavor? Or how is it at Michter's? Do you feel different because?
No, I wouldn't say I feel different. I mean, I'm proud.
Because you've worked at other places where you were kind of the only woman there. Now it's a very female centric workplace.
I mean, I guess the way I would characterize it is I don't feel different. I appreciate the fact that I have colleagues like Pam or Connie Cam or, other ladies in our team. I think it just, there's some inherent camaraderie by having, others that, understand and know where you're coming from and have had the experiences maybe that you've had. But I think that, we also offer kind of a different business model in that we're just really focused on great quality, and that's all there is. It's like, we just listen to each other and we value everyone's opinion around the table. There's no discussion of numerics of, demographics within our team or anything like that. It's just we value so much the contributions that each one of us bring to the table, and I think that's a very powerful thing. I mean, I wish every workplace was like that.
Everyone's opinion is valued. Everyone's opinion is equal. I mean, I don't feel that I'm looked at or, okay, Pam's a woman, let's ask her opinion about this. Let's ask her the color of the room. Should we paint it this color, No, we don't have that. Quite honestly, I mean, everyone, it's different because I've never had someone that I worked with in production right in my department. Victoria was over in Claremont. She was the only other woman really in production at the time that we worked there. And I was over at Booker Noe. I was the only woman, I think, supervisor, manager, or anything over at Booker Noe, or at Claremont in production. But what's nice is that there is two of us. So it is nice for me because, and we were just talking to someone out here about that a few minutes ago, that, you always have colleagues, and there's always people you can talk to. But it is nice to have another person who looks at things from a similar perspective. A woman's perspective is different than a man's. I mean, it just is.
It's usually better.
I'll agree with that. But no.
Actually, my wife's not here, so I'm not going to get any points for that. So.
No, you're not. So, but it's nice to have another person on the team that is a woman, and we have several. At Michter's, we do. It's probably in any position that I've ever had where we have the most women of any place I've ever worked in any organization.
We have to do a tasting here, but I'm going to come back to you on the subject here in a minute, Victoria. But so our first taste is Michter's Rye. Now, a lot of new people in here, so I'll just give a real brief description of rye whiskey. It's its own category. So bourbon has to be at least 51% corn. Rye whiskey has to be at least 51% rye. And rye, just like rye bread tastes differently than wheat bread, it's a completely different whiskey style. And Pamela's going to lead us through the tasting of the Michter's rye here.
Well, our rye is different than most. We use corn in our rye. It gives it a more balanced, I think, flavor. Our rye is excellent in cocktails, and I think you're going to find, I'm not going to tell you what you taste. I want you to taste it and enjoy it, but I think you're going to find it's a very smooth rye and very enjoyable. One comment I will make, when I first started at Michter's, we do tastings, as you pointed out, the team does tastings, and rye was not one of my favorites. It was always bourbon. And I've become a rye fan, a big rye fan. My absolute favorite is our rye barrel strength. And it's just a different experience for me.
You like the barrel strength over the 25-year-old rye?
I do.
Wow.
That is, I like all of ours. I don't have a favorite, as Willie always says. I don't have a favorite,
that's
but I would
testimony,
drink
though.
the most of them.
That's testimony, and you can, people here tonight, you can buy the rye tonight, and Pamela will be happy to sign that for you. Sign the bottle.
Andrea.
So Victoria, talking about where we are now, and we have the Maker's Mark tasting panel, which is all women, right? It's close to all women.
No, I mean, it's all employees, but...
A lot. Mm-hmm. Bushmills tasting panel in Ireland, all women. Their master blender, woman. Michter's with the amount of women there at their facility. Women are everywhere, but you just told us that in the 1990s, they said you couldn't have that supervisor position because you were a woman. Mm-hmm. What would happen today if someone told a young woman that?
Well, I'm in a very fortunate position because working for Maker's Mark, one of the things that we are really blessed with is a culture that's very unique in the bourbon industry. And I think that more distilleries are moving toward that, and I especially think with Marianne they will. But remember, Maker's Mark was created in a true partnership with Marge-Samuels and Bill
Yeah,
Sr.
they were co-owners.
They were co-owners.
Yeah.
Bill Sr. set out to create a bourbon that, as he said, didn't blow your ears off. And it wouldn't hit the back of your throat where the rye hot whiskeys hit. He wanted it to be a very forward palate. Well, the very forward palate means it falls in the region of your tongue, which is the front, which is where you detect sweet. Not sours on the side, not spicy or bitters towards the back and middle. So while he was busy distilling and creating the process that we now use to create the distillate for Maker's Mark using the wheat, Marge said, Bill, what are you going to do with this when it's of age and when you think you want to share it? Now, you're not going to just put it in some mason jar and hand it out to your friends and family. This is going to be a special product. And he said, I really don't know. You can work on that. So Marge created not only the bottle shape, she collected fine pewter, and we have her book, and her book is called Fine Pewter, Its Makers and Their Marks. Hence the name Maker's Mark, because on the bottom of the finest pieces of her pewter in her collection would be a mark. And she would use that book to look at it as an index to see who actually made that fine piece. She also was the one that created the iconic red wax dip. And, if you ask Bill Jr., when you have a chance to talk with him and you get to say, how did that all happen? He said, well, my mom commandeered our deep fat fryer. And she melted that wax in our kitchen, and she would try dipping different bottles to come up with a way to create a very unique top. So I've got almost there for the answer. The thing, if you understand, if you go into your stores and you see Maker's Mark on the shelf today, it's the only bottle in the distilled spirits industry that's on the shelf in its original design, having been designed by a woman. So the culture at Maker's Mark that they created was one of sharing, was one of leveraging the strengths of the people and the team to better the whole, to create a product that was iconic and unique, but very approachable and very shareable with their friends. So in the Samuels tradition, that's exactly how we manage. So in that environment, Fred, I can't really hear that answer. You know, you cannot do that as a woman.
I guess that was a poorly phrased question, how I put it. I guess from an overall industry perspective, I just don't think that conversation happens anymore, and that if anyone were to say to a woman, like, you cannot work here because you're a woman, I think that there would be charges pressed against them today.
Absolutely, with the legal community, but that's not to say that it isn't a little more subtle, okay? Mm-hmm. And I think the subtlety about it isn't I don't ever think, and I'm not really a Pollyanna kind of person, I tend to be a little skeptical, I don't necessarily think anymore that the attitude is push away, go away, because clearly we're not going to go away. I mean, women in the industry, in any industry, are not going to go away. There's too many brilliant minds out there. And I think that both men and women recognize that each brings something unique to the table, and we really need to leverage everyone's skills as we go forward and live in a global community. But I think the subtlety is that there are, to Marianne's point, so when you said more women in the sciences bring more interest into the production end of it, I think it really comes holistically from a cultural opportunity point of view. And I still think that sometimes, you know, as we go through in different cultural opportunities, people might not take the same kind of chance on a young woman necessarily than they would on a young man in a traditionally male-dominated field. But I do think it's changing.
Marianne, you're the closest to this, in that you've experienced this recently, especially, you know, when you were named Master Distiller. I received a lot of phone calls of people questioning that use of the title. I defended it. And you and for choosing that title. Do you agree with what Victoria said there, that maybe there's a little bit of unfairness that's just a little under the radar, unspoken sometimes?
I also have been very fortunate in the opportunities that I've had. When they first posed the chance to start training with Chris Morris to me, his previous trainee was a man. They selected me for many reasons, not just the fact that I was a female. I had the palate and the presence and the technical skills. But when I went into my boss's office and he said, do you want to train with Chris Morris and eventually be the next Woodford Reserve Master Distiller? It took my breath away, because I didn't see anybody else doing that, any other women doing that. And I think it was because of his championship of me that I was able to get that opportunity. And it might have been because of a total push of diversity in the company. It also could have been, right place, right time, but I'd like to think that,
You had a lot to do with it, too. Yeah.
I worked really hard to put myself in a position to get those opportunities. But I do agree, there is a subtlety. There's still a lot of women would say there's a wage difference between men and women still today. I've just been very fortunate, and it's the old guard coming and going too. I think there is, there's a change in generation that's going to move this disproportion.
Pamela, would you like to add to the topic in general of the women in the business coming in?
I get that. I get that they do look at me differently because I am a woman and that in this male-dominated industry. I have a hard time with that because I feel like, I'm probably one of the oldest on the stage, if not the oldest. But I feel like I don't look at myself that way. I don't look at myself as a woman. I don't put those limitations on myself. I do what I do, and I do the best of my ability to be the best at what I do. And I strive, for more and more. I'm never satisfied. And maybe that's a trait of probably everyone up here, I would say. So I don't really see myself as a woman when I look at myself in my position. I see myself as I do this job. And I hope that other people would see that same thing and say, hey, she's doing this job and she's good at that job. And obviously at Michter's, they recognize that. And, I'll be honest. When I was approached by Michter's, I was flabbergasted. I truly was. I was at the Booker No plant. And if anybody knows where Boston, Kentucky is, it's in the middle of nowhere. So, I'm thinking, nobody knows I'm down here. Nobody knows that I do this good job. But you know what? I do it because that's my reputation. And that's what I like to do, and I love it. But obviously, somebody noticed somewhere.
Yeah, word got around.
And that's great. And I was excited, and once I got over the initial shock that somebody knew I was down in Boston, I thought, man, this is great. This is an opportunity of a lifetime. And I love it.
I love that. I will tell you each that for what you do is, on the production side, it really just comes down to your whiskey. If in our little world, it just comes down to the whiskey. If it's good, they're gonna love you. If it's not, they're gonna let you know. So, and we're gonna have the next tasting here, Maker's 46, and this was actually a controversial whiskey.
Yes, it was.
Because you guys added French oak staves there, and kind of was one of the trendsetters in this barrel finishing process. So take us through the tasting of Maker's 46, how it came to be.
Okay. Well, it was not just controversial in how we actually created the unique flavor of 46, but it was even controversial on our own team. So in 2009, we're having an operational meeting at the Distillery in the Heritage Room, and there's, just a few of us sitting around the table. And Bill walks in, we're getting ready to start, and he sits down and he said, I just want to throw something out there to everybody. We're like, okay, Bill, because now you've got to remember, we only produce fully matured Maker's Mark at this point in time, okay? That's the only product on our shelf. He says, should we think about a slightly different flavor profile or a different product for Maker's Mark? Well, everybody in that room just was like, are you joking me? Bill. And he says, no, listen to the consumers. Everyone that is a dyed-in-the-wool Maker's fan drinks Maker's Mark. But every now and then, they like to try something a little different. Maybe after dinner, maybe on the veranda, maybe with different friends, maybe with dessert. Now, they always come back to Maker's Mark because they're loyal to Maker's Mark. But what if we were able to offer them a different palate? Well, we finally got over the shock after about 30 minutes of just staring at him, thinking, he can't be serious. And we really started to engage in what would that look like for Maker's Mark and what would that look like for our consumers. We contacted our barrel manufacturer, Brad Boswell, Independent Stave. He's a third-generation Cooper. And he shared with us different ways that wood can be treated, whether it be American oak or French oak, whether it can be seared, toasted, roasted, charred, any combination. And we actually started trying different flavor profiles of staves in fully matured Maker's Mark, okay? And as we progressed in our little test in the winter, because Bill said, we'll just test and then we'll take it to our consumers and see if they like it, we would kind of test the flavors. And at one point, we were testing a lab sample in the middle of the winter. It was in December, and it was in a warehouse. And we had some in a glass. There I was with the production team again, taking samples out of barrels. You know, I kind of like doing that. And we were tasting it, and this is what we had in our glass. So now I invite you, put yourself in a cold winter warehouse, and you have a little bit of this, whatever it is, out of the barrel, and you nose it. And it was very cold in the warehouse, so we kind of had to warm it to develop that nose and open it up. And if you're familiar with Maker's Mark, you can kind of think how Maker's Mark has that light caramel, sort of a nice little note, and then you nose this, and you get a bit more of that, don't you? There's a little bit more nose. We thought, oh, this is interesting. This is like just a little more Maker's Mark, and then we took a sip. Let it go everywhere in your mouth. Swallow. Now blow out the alcohol. Now where does that fall on your palate? Okay. Is it sweet? Is it like Maker's Mark? A little bit. Blow the alcohol out. The flavor profile, the sweetness, will be also still sort of on the forward of the tongue too, like Maker's Mark. It's a little bit more of Maker's Mark with a little bit more of a finish. And it almost has, if you will, a mouthfeel to it because it's still there. So what Maker's 46 represents for us with its seared French oak stave finish is a little bit more of what you get when you drink Maker's Mark. So it gives you something a little bit different to share with your friends and family.